The 2026 World Cup is finally here. In just a few days, the whistle will blow on the pitch in stadiums all across North America as fans from around the world flock to take in the biggest and most watched global sporting event, and they'll pay top dollar to do so. Boston, as one of the host cities, will be in the spotlight for much of the tournament. Gillette Stadium in Foxborough, which will be renamed to Boston Stadium for the World Cup, will be home to 7 matches. For all the buzz about the World Cup coming to the U.S., such a large logistical undertaking is proving to be a big test for Massachusetts. There's been no shortage of squabbles and gripes already, from disputes between FIFA and the town of Foxborough, to the cost of public transit options to safely shuttle fans to and from the games, to street closures in Boston, to delays in issuing licenses for watch parties all around the state. So are we ready? And was this whole thing really such a good idea in the first place? I'm Jordan Wolman, a senior reporter here at CommonWealth Beacon, and this is the Codcast, CommonWealth Beacon's podcast about policy and civic life here in Massachusetts. Today, I'm joined by Chris Dempsey, partner at Dempsey, an urban design firm who previously served as Assistant Secretary of Transportation under former Governor Deval Patrick. Thanks so much for being here, Chris.
Jordan, it's great to be on with you.
Chris, let's rip this Band-Aid right off. You are probably best known for your work leading the opposition to Boston's 2024 Olympic bid, which was successful given that the city dropped its bid to host the games in 2015. You were named Bostonian of the Year by Boston Globe magazine for that work and wrote a book chronicling that campaign. I don't hear you freaking out about our selection as a host city for the World Cup. Do you just really like soccer, or are you cool with how this is all shaking out for Boston?
Well, I am definitely a soccer fan and will admit that I'm excited to watch a bunch of the matches coming up this World Cup, although I do not have tickets. But Jordan, the number one question I get from friends, family, the media when this topic comes up is, why not start a no Boston World Cup 2026, right? You felt so passionately and strongly, along with others, about the Boston Olympic bid. What's the difference here? And I want to be clear that I have the same moral qualms about FIFA that I did about the IOC, and we can dig in more to those two opaque Switzerland-based organizations that are not friends of their host cities and that do not care about the interests of taxpayers. But there are fundamental differences between an Olympic bid and a World Cup bid. And the biggest difference, of course, is that you don't need to build a bunch of venues for the World Cup. And that was always our biggest concern with Boston 2024, was the need to build an Olympic stadium, an Olympic village, an aquatic center, a velodrome, a media center. The list of buildings goes on and on and on. And it was going to be taxpayers who were responsible for the cost overruns for all of those venues. So taxpayers are going to be on the hook here as well. And they've already contributed, I think, more than we should. But the order of magnitude is really 2 times less than the cost of the Olympics. The Boston 2024 games would have cost city and state taxpayers on the order of magnitude of $10 billion. The World Cup is more like $100 million. And while I'm not happy about those dollars supporting FIFA, it's just much less of an issue and much less of a cost and a disruption than the Olympic Games would have been.
It's really interesting as I've sort of watched the planning and sometimes scrambling leading up to the tournament starting this week. The vibes, at least here in our neck of the woods in Boston, just don't feel great right now around the World Cup. Ticket prices are just outrageous. And then in Boston, just to get to the game, trains are $80 round trip. Buses, $95 round trip to and from Foxborough. Did we not use our money effectively or for the best priorities here? Because I'm looking around and I'm seeing free SEPTA in Philadelphia coming back from the games. New York City raffling off discounted game tickets. Can you just talk me through, the choices we made around what to do with our money and how to make this the best experience possible for everyone?
Yeah, Jordan, there's a lot there. And let's start with just the narrower question of transit, which was also a big topic of conversation when we were debating Boston 2024. So if you go back to the original bidding documents that were put forward by US Soccer and the bidding nonprofit entities that kind of rounded up all of the individual cities or regions to bid on these games, they actually committed to FIFA that transit would be free for all ticket holders. And that would be part of your soccer ticket purchase is basically a free T pass or free MTA pass in New York or Muni pass in San Francisco. And then somewhere along the line, that promise got lost, as it often does when you're dealing with bidding for sporting mega events. You put all sorts of promises in those documents. You promise the sun, moon, and the stars, and you don't really worry about the costs or the implications because you say, well, hey, we've got time to figure out the details. We need to win this thing. And that was always part of our concern with Boston 2024. If you look at the bid documents, they were promising all sorts of things, some of which were possible, some of which were completely impossible. And so that promise got lost along the way. And you've got these transit agencies that are sort of left holding the bag. And this is just one example of many where FIFA and the bidding committees have shirked their responsibility and left the public sector responsible for some of their promises. And I'm actually very defensive of the T here. Maybe that's because I worked inside of the transportation bureaucracy for the state, and I appreciate all of the pressures that folks inside of organizations like MassDOT and the MBTA are dealing with right now. But the T needs to invest tens of millions of dollars to pull this event off. We've already seen it last week with the ribbon cutting at the Foxborough station, commuter rail station, and I suppose that's a upgrade that will benefit people in the future. Although to me, it seems like it mostly benefits the craft group and not the public at large. Um, but beyond that, all of the operational trade-offs that they're making, that includes reducing commuter rail service in other parts of the system. So daily commuters are going to bear the brunt of the need for FIFA to shuttle people in and out. And it's also just the time and attention. And I appreciate that for the public, that may be the least sympathetic argument. And it certainly was on the Olympics. But, I want my MBTA general manager and my transportation secretary, who of course now is the same person, not always the same person, but now it's Secretary General Manager Phil Eng, I want him focused on the day-to-day commutes of people in Massachusetts. I want him making the long-term decisions about how to improve the transportation system in the Commonwealth. I don't really want him in an ideal world focused on how to get 3,000 drunk Scotsmen from downtown Boston to Foxborough. I appreciate that's a problem that's been put on his plate, but it's not necessarily to me the thing that best advances the interests of the Commonwealth. And so I think what the T is doing with those ticket prices is a couple of things. One is they are trying to recoup some of the costs, the operational costs of kind of upending their normal schedule, rearranging trains, providing more staff. All of that is going to be necessary for the T. I think the other thing that they're trying to do, frankly, is just sort of manage crowds a little bit, right? Having a reservation system for commuter rail is a pretty unusual thing to do, but it's really important in this case because not only do you not want just too many people riding the trains and not have the trains available for them, but you also don't want a lot of non-ticket holders riding the trains because the message has been sort of put out by the organizing committee, basically like don't come to Foxborough if you don't have a ticket because the security is going to be so tight, the space is going to be so limited there that we just don't want a lot of non-ticket holders milling about during the games or the matches. So I'm sympathetic to the T when it comes to trying to recoup those costs. I do think on the scale of buying a World Cup ticket, maybe buying a ticket from elsewhere around the world, whether it's England or France or Scotland, to come to Massachusetts for the event, the $80 cost is a pretty small number relative to the other things that people are paying. But I do appreciate that it's a shocking number for those of us that are used to paying, 5, 10, $15 at most for a commuter rail ticket.
let's stick with public transit. It strikes me, I don't know that a lot of people outside of our region know this, that Gillette Stadium is one of the farthest stadiums from the nearest major city that there is. So just, logistically, it takes longer. It's not as easy as, it's not as easy to ferry thousands of people down there. I mean, ultimately, when you factor in too that the governor has just thrown her support behind keeping bars open until 3 a.m. Here in Massachusetts, do we have what it takes to seamlessly pull this off and live up to that world class city status? Because a lot of this is about raising Boston's profile around the world. And to your point, do the investments that were made to do this, the Foxborough, station improvements to name one, does that raise our overall bar, or does it actually distract and siphon money and time and investment away from the things that the people who actually live here day to day need?
Yeah. So Jordan, I very much appreciate that the boosters of the World Cup, whether that's FIFA or the bid committee or just others who are involved in this event, want to position the World Cup as an opportunity to show off Boston on the world stage, to make generational investments, and to create a positive, virtuous cycle of more and more people coming to visit because they had such a great time at the World Cup. And I completely reject that as a reason to host the World Cup or the Olympics. And here's why. Maybe the most clear critique is that the number one reason that people visit a place is because of word of mouth from their friends, neighbors, family, colleague who tell them that they just did a trip and it was a great time and they should go to a place. So, hey, I went to Paris, and the Louvre is an incredible museum. You can see the Mona Lisa. I highly recommend it. It's definitely worth going to, right? You talk about that around the water cooler, and all of a sudden your colleague's like, well, gee, I want to go to Paris too. And that certainly happens with World Cup visitors. But the thing that they say to their colleagues is, I went to the World Cup. The World Cup is amazing. You should go to the World Cup. Meaning, wherever it's going to be in 4 years, go to that place, not to the actual location where it was held this year. It's about the experience of participating in the games and the energy that exists around that, not about the host cities themselves. And so I don't think we're going to see a virtuous cycle, no matter how well we pull this off, of people deciding to come to Boston, for tourism. Frankly, our tourism industry is already pretty strong. Not that it can't be stronger, right? But traditionally, when you look at hotel vacancies, the hotel vacancies are not very high, as in occupancy is very high over the course of the summer. We don't necessarily need a lot more tourists in the summer. It's really in the winter that we probably need more relative to the summer. But I just don't expect that those Scotsmen or Frenchmen or Englishmen are going to go home and say, gee, you got to go to Boston. They're going to say you got to go to the World Cup, right? I think more importantly here is that Boston is already on the world stage as a place of innovation, of education, of research. We are one of the few places in the world that invented the COVID vaccine that saved millions, tens of millions of lives. And we are always going to be known for Harvard and MIT and BU, and go down the list of universities, of Mass General Hospital, of Brigham and Women, right? These are the things that Boston is known for around the world. People send their sick from around the world to Boston for the best healthcare. They send their young people to our universities for the best educations. And that's already our brand. That's not going to change whether people successfully got from downtown Boston to Foxborough, on time or a little bit delayed on a commuter rail train.
I mentioned the bad vibes, and I guess I should quickly add on that. I don't want to say bad vibes for bad vibes' sake. Like, that's a real hard thing to recover from, that feeling in terms of economic development and tourism, if things were to not go great. And as I mentioned, things to date obviously have not been necessarily all smooth. But on the bright side, aside from just the scale of this year's World Cup being different from the Olympic bid that was being discussed a little bit over a decade ago, are there any improvements that you've seen in the city or in the region that better position us to host a major event like this?
Are you asking like versus a decade ago when we were fighting Boston 2024?
Right. Yeah. So between then and now, I understand that, you know, you're not as wound up, right, about this year's World Cup as you were about the Olympics then because of the scale, the difference in scale of the two things.
Yep.
But that aside, have we done anything better since then? Are we better positioned as a region to take this on?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, I think in some ways our transit system is operating a lot better than it was in 2015. Certainly, the winter of 2015 was that memorable winter with feet and feet of snow and many snowstorms, and the system shut down. And I think in general, people feel like under General Manager Eng's leadership, the system is working a little bit better today. Although, I will tell you that um, just last week, my wife was alerted that the Green Line was down, and she had an important meeting to get to at 8 o'clock downtown, and so she took an Uber instead because she wasn't going to make it on time. And I happened to walk by a Green Line station, and there were dozens of people uh, leaving the train without any sense that a shuttle bus was going to come and save them, and they were just sort of like sitting there grumbling, right? So day to day, there are still issues on that system, and um, I don't know exactly what the metrics would say about on-time performance then versus now. I do think the vibes are better now than they were 3 or 4 years ago, but it's hard to think back, a decade ago. I think in many other ways, our challenges now are just as bad or worse. I'm just not sure, how much they intersect necessarily with the World Cup, right? So we know that like housing remains a top issue in Massachusetts. It's definitely worse now than it was in 2015, and it was really bad in 2015. um, I don't see the Olympics or the World Cup helping with our housing issues. On road transportation, our congestion has mostly come back to what it was pre-COVID. People are really frustrated with the gridlock that seems to happen, all day, every day on many roads throughout the region. You can't predict it in the way that you could as being kind of a rush hour thing in the past, and that I don't think we've made much progress on at all. In fact, arguably, I think we've gotten worse or fallen behind other regions that have made innovations and investments since 2015 that Boston or Massachusetts has not. So, um, look, I think I continue to think that we are going to quote unquote pull this off in the sense that I'm not expecting major disasters. I'm not expecting uh, that we're going to be on the front page of international media saying that Massachusetts is a failure. But I also would never look to the World Cup as the um, milestone or the measuring stick for how strong we are as a community or region. We got lots of work to do, regardless of whether we're hosting this event.
Long term, Chris, should we be trying to do this stuff more often? I mean, we always have limited dollars. The fundamental costs of what it takes to get ready for something like this, are those investments better suited going somewhere else? Are we getting the bang for our buck that we want to see when we put the time and energy and money into playing host to something like this? Or does the infrastructure planning that goes into supporting a mega event like the World Cup translate into longer term benefits for the region?
Well, I certainly want Massachusetts to think big. And again, I think we are already a world class city that has a sizable international brand and presence. But we've also got a lot of work to do to make people's lives better on a day to day basis and just to make this region and this state work more efficiently and more effectively for people than it does today. I get very uncomfortable with the gray areas and murkiness between the public and private sector on these kinds of bids. And that was a fundamental critique that we had of Boston 2024. So we talk about this bid as if Boston bid on it, but the games are happening in Foxborough, right? So clearly the city of Boston has a role, but so does the town of Foxborough. And that means, of course, the state is going to have a role as well because this is ultimately a regional event. And there's just unanswered questions about who is responsible for what, who covers the cost overruns, who's expected to bear the costs and the risks of the coordination and the actual putting on of these events, the security of these events. And I think that these private bidding committees, essentially under FIFA's leadership or FIFA's guidance, really take advantage of our civic and regional pride. And they say, this is your bid. You need to do XYZ to make sure it's a success. And it turns out that XYZ comes with a really big price tag that FIFA is not willing to help contribute to in a substantial way, even though FIFA is making billions and billions of dollars off of this World Cup. They're making that money at the expense of the host cities. The host cities feel this responsibility or obligation to step in with resources, with investments, with planning, with coordination. And I think we all kind of wonder and scratch our heads at the end of this, like, was it really worth it? And so that doesn't mean we can't be thinking big. It doesn't mean that we can't host big events. But I do think we should hold our elected officials and ourselves to a very high standard about when we are truly bidding as a state or as a municipality or some other governmental entity, and when this is really a private sector event that requires some public support, some public coordination, but that we expect the private sector to really bear the costs of. And that's an ongoing critique of the Olympics and of FIFA. And I think it's, to be very clear, not unique to Massachusetts in any way. When you read the media and coverage from other communities around North America, they are saying a lot of the same things that I just said.
If this goes well, does it change in any way how you think about these sorts of things in the future? Will you be out there supporting a Boston Olympics 2048 bid? Are there lessons that you feel like could be learned here that could be applied moving forward? Or do those same sort of fundamental critiques stand sort of no matter what about FIFA and the IOC, concerns that, I think are, there's an established track record of FIFA facing serious allegations of corruption in the past. And to your point, um, you know, what FIFA expects or maybe even demands of its host city or cities, um, they may chip in very little to support the goals that it has for itself that it profits off of. So I guess I'm just curious, like, is there anything that can convince you moving forward that, you know what, like, this went well. This is something that, you know, yes, it took investment, but some of these projects, some of these infrastructure improvements are going to stand and last well past the actual event itself and serve the people of the community well and boost the economic mobility and the transit access of the region, or the fundamentals are just too hard to overcome.
Yeah, look, I mean, again, I think that we are going to quote unquote pull this off. I think it will not be a disaster. I think it's going to be fine. And by the way, we said the same thing about the 2.5 weeks during which Boston would host the Olympics in 2024. We admitted in our critiques and opposition to the Olympics that the Olympics themselves would be pretty fun and would be a big party that people would enjoy and participate in. It's really the issues leading up to the games and the ones that follow. And um, I think if the World Cup is like a flesh wound on your municipal budgets, the Olympics would have been like losing a limb. Again, it's 2 orders of magnitude larger. And so I will always and consistently oppose the city of Boston, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts participating in an Olympic bid because you put way more in than you get out of that kind of event. The World Cup is just a much smaller scale, and it's why you're seeing me glad to participate in today's podcast, but not out there, in the streets with a sign organizing opposition to this, because it's just not that big a deal relative to other things. But I would really caution anyone whose conclusion from the fun that they might have at the World Cup being that we should continue to look to get in bed with FIFA or the IOC or other closed off, opaque entities whose sole interest is in advancing their own cause and who do not care about the host communities that they really use, I think, in a parasitic way before they then move on to the next place. And so it's going to be hard to convince me, even if things go great, even if the U.S. gets into the finals and wins, that this is something that we should be welcoming back. But I'm also not going to oppose it if 24 years down the road or something, it might come back to the U.S. I'll offer just one more point here, which is, the city of Chicago reviewed the requirements of hosting. This is about a decade ago now, when the bid was being put together, and Rahm Emanuel was the mayor of Chicago, and he looked at the details. He's a pretty smart, sophisticated guy, and he just said, this is not worth it. And so Chicago is not hosting a World Cup venue this year. I don't think anybody that's listening to this podcast thinks that Chicago is somehow less of a capable city or a world-class city or less important in, the nation's history or the nation's future because it's not hosting 7 or 8 soccer games in the summer of 2026. That is just not the metric that we should use to understand whether a place is working well and whether it's succeeding and thriving. We should be using much more boring, but much more important metrics like how long does it take to get to work? What's the cost of housing? What's the unemployment rate? How are we doing on public health? How are we doing at our public schools? I know that those are much less sexy than thinking about, again, 10,000 drunken Scotsmen descending on Boston and having a big party, or the Haitian American community celebrating Haiti being in the World Cup. And I'm certainly pulling for Haiti as an underdog in this World Cup to do very well. But while those are fun things to think about, they should not be the bread and butter of our municipal, state, and federal focus as governments or people that care about how their governments are working. So I'm sorry to be so dull and boring in that commentary, but I really do think it's part of what's made Massachusetts great over preceding centuries is that we focus on the basics and not on the flashy. And I think we'd be wise to continue that trend in general.
Chris, this was great. Thank you so much for your time.
Jordan, great to be back on the Codcast and looking forward to being on again in the future.
Thanks again to Chris Dempsey for joining me on the Codcast, and thank you for listening. I'm Jordan Wolman. Our production and theme music is done by Charlie Cozella. Leave a rating and review wherever you're hearing this now if you want to help other folks find us, and email codcast@commonwealthbeacon.org if you ever want to get in touch directly. We'll be back in your ears next week.